Hi, I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the president of the Academy. I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's lecture entitled Cascading, Crises, and Prospects for Peace, which will be delivered by H.R. McMaster, this semester Stephen M. Kellen lecturer. What can I say? I'm glad that it is drizzling a little bit outside. Otherwise, I'd be tempted to say class is dismissed and we should just all go out and have another glass of wine. But instead, we're here to be intellectually nourished. General McMaster will discuss the growing links between today's major conflicts, of which there seem to be no shortage, and the broader contest for global influence with China. He will also address why the U.S. and its allies have struggled to deter or effectively respond to aggression in recent years, and how we might prevent or stop these interconnected wars from further expanding. Let me first say a word about the Stephen M. Kellen lectureship. It was established in 2004 with the generous support of the Anna Maria and Stephen Kellen Foundation and the descendants of Hans and Ludmila Arnold. The program honors the founding benefactor of the American Academy in Berlin, the late Stephen M. Kellen. If you know anything about the Academy, you know that Stephen Kellen was an ardent supporter of the American Academy from the very outset. Indeed, it wouldn't have been here without his support. And he remained financially supportive and intellectually engaged for the rest of his life. He spent time in this very villa, courting his wife, Anna Maria Arnold. And then later in New York, they lived together, and he took control of the Arnold Family Bank, which he would eventually run. And that is why each year the Stephen M. Kellen lectureship brings experts from business, government, finance, culture, and academia to the Academy's Hans Arnold Center. Past Stephen M. Kellen lecturers include Nobel laureate Joe Stiglitz of Columbia University, Columbia professor of the School of International and Public Affairs, Michael Doyle, New York Times journalist Peter Baker, and many, many others. And I want to express my sincerest and deepest gratitude to the Kellen family, who've been such extraordinary supporters of the Academy throughout our existence. Okay. Yes. H.R. McMaster is the Fuad and Michelle Ajami Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. As someone who knew Fuad a little bit, I have to say it's great to meet someone who holds the position named for him. He is also the Bernard and Susan Leotaud. Okay, thank God. Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute and lecturer at Stanford's Graduate School of Business. He is a graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point, and he served as a commissioned officer in the U.S. Army for 34 years. He retired as a lieutenant general in June 2018 after serving as the 25th assistant to the U.S. President for National Security Affairs. Before that, he was involved in designing the future Army as director of the Army Capabilities Integration Center and deputy commanding general for the futures of U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command. He was commanding general of the Maneuver Center of Excellence at Fort Benning and oversaw all training and education for the Army's infantry, armor, and cavalry. He commanded a number of different units in Afghanistan from 2010 to 2012, the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment in Iraq from 2005 to 2006, and Eagle Troop 2nd Army Cavalry Regiment in Operation Desert Storm, 1990 to 1991. Those names are flying by you. His action in command is legendary. I can't say anything more concise or exactly on the point. He served as overseas advisor to the most senior commanders in the Middle East, Iraq, and Afghanistan. He was a National Security Affairs Fellow at Hoover from 2002 to 2003. He holds a PhD in military history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He taught at West Point, and he is the author of the best-selling books Battlegrounds, The Fight to Defend the Free World, and perhaps even more famously, Dereliction of Duty, Lyndon Johnson, Robert McNamara, the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Lies That Led to Vietnam, a classic that belongs in every library of military affairs. In 2024, he released his most recent book, At War with Ourselves, My Tour of Duty in the Trump White House. I can't recommend it highly enough. And your fellow feeling and sympathy for the man will increase immeasurably once you read that. What I have to say, you can disagree with me, you can get mad at me, HR, but it sounds like the worst 13 months of anyone's life, including all the time in battle. So you can, I'll let you amend that as you like. It's meant to express sympathy. So he is the host of Battlegrounds, Vital Perspectives on Today's Challenges, and is a regular on Goodfellas. Goodfellas? Both produced by the Hoover Institution. That's not about mobsters, though. No. He is also a distinguished university fellow at Arizona State University. I should say that we met last year at an event that General McMaster was kind enough to do with the Academy in the Bay Area. And that was the genesis for this visit. And I said, you really should come to the Academy, thinking he would say, yeah. And here he is. So it was a great exchange. And we actually had a terrific conversation that day. Where were we, at BCG? Yes, at BCG, overlooking all kinds of beautiful scenery. His talk will run 30 minutes, maybe longer, maybe shorter, and will be followed by an onstage discussion and then audience Q&A. Let me just say, I feel deeply honored that H.R. McMaster is here tonight at the Academy. He's notched an extraordinary record. If you want to ask questions, raise your hand. I think we've talked about that enough this semester. And if you're joining us on the live stream, please type your question in the Q&A platform. And without further ado, General McMaster, the floor is yours. Oh.
Hey, Daniel, thank you for that all too generous introduction. And thanks to all of you for the opportunity to be here, the leaders and staff of this great institution. You've been so welcoming to Katie and me. We just got here yesterday, but we were already having just a wonderful time. And thanks to the trustees who are here and the support that you give this fantastic institution. We were on a riverboat cruise yesterday, and with Kati, I had a chance to talk about how this is just a wonderful manifestation of Richard Holbrooke's vision. And we're sharing some funny stories about a man I admired tremendously. And, you know, I think the mission is more important than ever of this great institution, to strengthen cultural and intellectual ties. The fellows do that, who I got to meet yesterday. You're all doing fascinating work here on various projects of importance to the arts and history and literature and music. Because, you know, I never thought that when Daniel and I had our conversation in San Francisco, that we would be at a period of really high tension in U.S.-German relations and U.S.-European relations in particular. So these cultural and intellectual ties are really important. And I think it's useful to just kind of recount where some of these tensions came from over the last few years. Of course, there's trade issues. There was the suspension of direct U.S. military assistance to Ukraine. There are fears of pressuring Ukraine to agree to terms for a ceasefire that were unacceptable to Ukraine and to Europe, and then maybe that driving a wedge even further in the transatlantic relationship. Gosh, we had all kinds of direct criticisms of Europe by U.S. leaders. Some extremely lacking in tact, to say the least. Wolfgang is here, at the Munich Security Conference comes to mind, and Davos and so forth. And then those have turned into some mutual criticisms that I think are seem to be driving us apart or causing even more strains in the relationship. But there were threats beyond tariffs and trade. There was a threat to invade Greenland. I mean, really? I mean. And the insults toward Canada, even Canada. I mean, they're just so nice, the Canadians. I mean, that's not crazy. So I really think that we seem like we have a lot to get over, right? And we do have a lot to get over. And I don't mean to in any way trivialize the tensions that we've seen that are created on both sides of the Atlantic and maybe exacerbated by domestic politics, I would say, in the United States and in Europe as well, right, where we've seen a high degree of political polarization. I'll talk a bit more about that. But I think that we have to remember at this moment that nations are much more than governments, and much more than a federal government or the single head of a federal government. And so it's these bonds that are fostered here that are more important than ever. And so tonight I have kind of a message of optimism, right? And I'm sure you're thinking, are you kidding me? Really? I mean, but I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic about the transatlantic relationship. I'm optimistic about the future of our free and open societies and our free market economic systems for three reasons. The first of all is kind of just maybe gravity, but really based on our common threats to Europe, common threats to our free and open societies and our democratic governments and our free market economic systems. Hey, they're not going away. Those threats are serious and they're not going away. And what's at the forefront of those threats, I think, is an axis of aggressors. These are authoritarian regimes that are coalescing around the two revanchist powers on the Eurasian landmass of China and Russia. Each of them have different objectives between China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, until recently Venezuela, others. But what they share in common is a desire to tear down the existing rules of international discourse and replace them with a new set of rules that are sympathetic to their authoritarian forms of government, and in China's case in particular, its statist mercantilist economic model. And those are indeed common threats to the United States and Europe. The second is, hey, we need each other. We need each other to cope with those threats and to build a better future for generations to come. And Europe needs the United States, and heck, the United States needs Europe in this competition. I'll talk a bit more about how and what we can do together to cope with these threats and to strengthen our economies, to strengthen our security. And the third, and you're going to say, what the heck is he talking about here, is that we are at a moment of great opportunity, and we need one another to take advantage of this great opportunity that we're facing. And so, what I'd like to do is to break this down into three parts to make those three points: the common threats, the need for one another, and to see the current situation, despite the tensions that we've seen that I mentioned at the outset, and the difficulties, that this is as a moment of opportunity. So what I'd like to first do is review briefly how our threats to security have evolved over the past 4 decades. When I first arrived in Nuremberg, Germany, at the Bavarian American Hotel right there in the Centrum, waiting for a house to open for Katie to move over, and I was drawing pictures of the partially constructed house because I had my daughter believing I was building the house myself. She was 3, I think, at the time when we moved here, and to see how those threats have evolved since that time. You're going to think, how's the heck are you going to do that in 30 minutes? But I will, I promise. And then second, describe how an axis of aggressors have coalesced, the axis I mentioned, and why they've been emboldened, I think, especially since 2014, but how they then overextended and based on overconfidence and a perception of the Western world, of Europe and the United States as weak, decadent, and divided. And then finally suggest ways that the United States, Canada, and Europe and other free societies, allies and partners internationally can work together to restore peace, to prevent cascading crises from cascading further, and build a more secure and prosperous future. So the first part, how these threats to security have evolved. I think in the post 1991 period, it was easy to be optimistic, right? I mean, there were great reasons for optimism. I remember our cavalry troop, Eagle Troop of the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, which was headquartered in Bamberg, but was patrolling the border out of Camp Harris, outside of Coburg, Germany. When we went from one moment in October of 1989, staring down East German border guards, and the next moment seeing the gates thrown open, and then tens, and then hundreds, and then thousands, and then tens of thousands of East Germans pouring across that border, bearing bouquets of flowers, bottles of wine. Get emotional, actually. There were hugs and tears of joy. It was the beginning of the breakup of the Soviet Union. The Cold War was over, right, without firing a shot. Then that same cavalry troop, a year later, deployed to Operation Desert Shield that became Desert Storm after the August 1990 invasion of Kuwait. I remember Katie and I were in like a silly argument sometime after the wall came down and before Saddam invaded Iraq. She said, you're just mad because you don't have an enemy anymore. And so, thank you, Saddam Hussein. Thank you so much for providing that service. And so after that lopsided victory in Desert Storm, there were even more reasons to be optimistic. And so as we looked at the post-Cold War world, many people, I think, bought into three assumptions about the nature of that post-Cold War world. And sadly, assumptions that turned out to be false. Assumption one was that, that ideological competition was a relic of the past, right? An arc of history had guaranteed the primacy of our free and open societies over closed authoritarian systems. The second assumption related to that was a great power rivalry and competition. Hey, that's a relic of the past, right? And the third was, hey, that our prowess in the West, our technological prowess, our military prowess that was put on display in handily defeating the fourth largest army in the world, the Iraqi army, would guarantee our security well into the future. Remember this orthodoxy of like the revolution in military affairs and no pure competitor, all of that. And so this was a period of overconfidence, a period of, I would say, that had a touch of hubris in it, and a period of time that was a setup. I mean, like Icarus, we were flying kind of too high in the 1990s. And as a result, we were set up for strategic shocks and disappointments in the 2000s. Of course, the mass murder attacks of 9/11, where a terrorist organization used box cutters and airplanes to bypass our military prowess, to murder over 3,000 people, and to take trillions of dollars out of the U.S. economy. Then disappointments that followed, the unanticipated length and difficulty and cost of the wars in Afghanistan and then later in Iraq. I mean, I think we often want to debate, should we have done it? Being the invasion of Iraq in 2003, I think we should talk a heck of a lot more about who the heck thought it would be easy and why did they think it would be easy. And then, of course, toss in a financial crisis, 2008, 2009, underpinning the same period of time as a period I know who's been a fellow here, George Packer, wrote about in a book called The Unwinding, were big transitions in the global and the U.S. economy that were happening in this period of time, associated mainly with China's entry into the World Trade Organization and the loss of so many jobs, manufacturing jobs in particular, in the heartland, and how that created another kind of crisis, another body blow there. Hey, how about tossing in an opioid epidemic on top of that? How about then the effects of social media and the business model of social media companies to get more advertising dollars through more and more clicks, and to get more clicks through more and more extreme content and conspiracy theories and so forth, right? And of course, the list goes on beyond that, and we could fast forward even to a pandemic and other traumas. But it was a period of traumas, and I would say that the emotional impetus behind U.S. foreign policy shifted with that end of the period of optimism into a period of pessimism. And from maybe a period during which we undervalued and underestimated the costs and risks of action to a period of time where we underestimated the costs and risks of inaction or disengagement from complex challenges abroad. And this is when I believe that this threat from the axis of aggressors began to coalesce. I'll just fast forward quickly because I want to begin in 2014. But in December of 2017, I was sitting in that back room of the Oval Office, that is, in some administrations, it might be an inner sanctum. It's nothing like that in the Trump administration, believe me. I mean, there are people vying for his attention. Fox News is on. I mean, it's not a sanctuary of any kind. But on this occasion, I had a one-on-one lunch with him. He ordered chicken noodle soup and his mother's meatloaf recipe, which I enjoyed. And he was in a good mood. I thought, okay, hey, I was reviewing with him. I think what were very significant accomplishments, Dan kind of joked about how if it was hellish there. Actually, I thought it was a privilege to serve every day. It was, I guess in retrospect, I was a bit like, remember the character, the knight in the Holy Grail, the Black Knight? I was a little bit like that. I was like, it's only a flesh wound, So, so it was a privilege to serve there. And so I was reviewing, I think, these significant accomplishments in foreign policy, the big shift in policy toward China, for example, imposing more sanctions on Russia in the first year of his presidency than the previous 8 years of the Obama administration. He would soon close another consulate. He closed 2 consulates. He expelled 60 undeclared Russian intelligence agents. It took Europe a lot longer to do that. It took the massive reinvasion of Ukraine to do that. But I was talking about other issues, Venezuela, which was a 180-degree outshift in foreign policy under Trump, the Cuba policy. So we reviewed all this. But there was one decision that he had made when he made the decision on a Russia strategy that he had not yet given final approval for implementation. And that was the sale and provision of Javelin missiles to Ukraine. So on the short end of the table there, after we had eaten, I rolled out a chart I had brought with me, and it was a timeline that ran left to right. And on the bottom of that timeline was a world event that portrayed a sense of weakness, I think, to this axis of what would become an axis of aggressors. And on top of that was a subsequent act of Russian aggression. Think, for example, the unenforced red line in Syria, when we had promised, hey, we will respond militarily if the Assad regime uses chemical weapons to commit mass murder of innocents in Syria, and then we didn't do anything, and so what happens next? I think what happens next is illegal annexation of Crimea and the first invasion of Ukraine. What also happens, by the way, is the building of violence and weaponizing of violence in the South China Sea. And so the point I was making to President Trump, I said, hey, I know what you're hearing from Putin. I know what you're hearing from a lot of people is that if we provide weapons to Ukraine and sell them to the Ukrainians, it will be provocative. But that's not real. That's not true. What provokes Vladimir Putin is the perception of weakness. And if you provide these capabilities to the Ukrainians, you could prevent a much larger war. So I said, okay, General, and I gave him a memo, and he signed for selling half, providing half to the Ukrainians. So that's the theme I'd like to pick up on, because I think it has been the perception of weakness that has emboldened this axis of aggressors and led to this condition today when they're aiding and abetting each other in a very active way. I think the more proximate sort of perceptions of weakness have a lot to do with the relaxation of sanctions, for example, on Iran. I'll talk a bit more about that. But I think about when President Biden was trying his best, well-meaning, to allay Vladimir Putin's security concerns by going to Geneva and laying out his red lines. You know what that means to Putin? Everything else is a green line. Except for those red lines. Pulling vessels out of the Black Sea, suspending lethal assistance to the Ukrainians, withdrawing our military advisors to Ukraine, evacuating and scuttling our embassy in Ukraine. So this was a failure of deterrence, I believe, based primarily on perception of weakness. Releasing intelligence, yeah, it's a good idea. Threatening sanctions, yeah, probably a good idea, but insufficient to deter Vladimir Putin. And so I think even before that, why did Vladimir Putin invade Ukraine in February of 2022? I think it goes back to August of 2021 and the policies of two administrations, the Trump and Biden administration, that were to withdraw from Afghanistan at no matter what was going to be the consequence. And it was that self-defeat, as I would describe it, and disastrous, deadly, a real humiliation of a withdrawal from Afghanistan that led to that massive reinvasion of Ukraine in 2022. Now, think about the joint message, right? That Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping expressing their brotherly love for each other as they're about to do again, right? Or just did in Moscow in their 25th meeting just yesterday. The joint statement they released just before the Beijing Olympics, just before the massive reinvasion of Ukraine. What did they tell us? They said, hey, this is a new era of international relations. The message to the United States, to Europe, to the West was, hey, you're finished. We're in charge now. Get used to it. Fast forward now to October of 2023. What's happening in October 2023? What's happening in October 2023 is inside Israel, there are some problems associated with Prime Minister Netanyahu's judicial reform efforts. There are big protests going on. Some reservists are not showing up for duty. Hey, there are problems in the U.S.-Israeli relationship. President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu, they don't get along too well. Also, it's a period of time when we were unable to sustain support for the Ukrainians. Remember, we couldn't bring to a vote a bill to continue to provide weapons because that narrow, thin majority in the House of Representatives. So now imagine that you're Ayatollah Khamenei and you're sitting in Iran. You've seen that the Biden administration is not enforcing sanctions. You've watched your coffers fill up with $100 billion of extra revenue you didn't anticipate. Where did that money go? It went to increase the stipends to Hezbollah, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Assad regime in Syria, the Houthis, who he also undesignated as a terrorist organization, and it flowed to the Hashd-e-Shaabi militias in Iran. And so he's making great progress in his plan to build a land bridge to the Mediterranean by keeping the Arab world enmeshed in perpetual civil war and keeping them perpetually weak, so he can surround Israel with the ring of fire. And then on October 7th, what does he do? He says, hey, it's time to light the ring of fire. And what his design was to do was to destroy Israel and kill all the Jews. That was what was on the top of his to-do list in October of 2023. Now consider the world from the perspective of Nicolas Maduro. His sanctions are alleviated also under the belief, I think, of forlorn hope, that he would respect the results of the last presidential election. And so what he does is he increases his cash flow through the black economy. He takes under his wing narcotics organizations from around the hemisphere, provides them with cover for his cut, enriches himself, strengthens his grip on power, invalidates that election. This is a man, of course, who's driven 8 million of his own people out of his country, 1/3 of the population. But they're in the ascendancy, all of them. They're pretty confident in this period of time. North Korea, who would ever have thought that North Korea would be providing North Korean troops, 15,000 of them, to fight alongside Russians on European territory? Who thought that they would provide 10 million rounds of artillery? Every other round that's fired in Ukraine is North Korean. Who thought that the Iranians would provide the Shahed drone? Who thought that there would be an Iranian-designed factory in Moscow manned by North Korean slave laborers who were producing those Shaheds for this massive onslaught onto Ukraine? Who would have thought, fast forward to the multi-front war, the six-front war that Israel found itself in, that they would be fighting on this multi-front war, and part of it would involve shutting off the Bab el-Mandeb by the Houthis, who were being fed intelligence by the Russians and the Chinese. So these are interconnected. China is underwriting the entire effort, I would say, of the axis of aggressors, and in this period of time, up until recently, they're the protagonists. But what did they all do? This is what I mentioned at the outset. They all overextended. And they overextended because of arrogance and because of their belief in our profound weakness. Nicolas Maduro, as cocky as he was, he's in a New York prison. That 1 week offensive in Ukraine, how did that turn out when they packed their dress uniforms? The Russians packed their dress uniforms in their armored vehicles for the parade in Kyiv. 1 million casualties later, the Russian economy in shambles. Putin sitting on piles of cash he can't convert. He has a severe labor shortage, stagnant economy, and some real problems internally, I believe, that will have not yet met the light of day. How about Iran? How did it work out for them? Didn't work out well for them. Certainly didn't work out well for Hamas or Hezbollah, who was decapitated and decimated. Once Hezbollah collapsed, what happened to Assad? He's gone. What happened to Russia's then proxy in the Middle East, so Russia could serve as both arsonist and fireman to protect their influence in the Middle East? He's probably, I think he's playing video games in an apartment in Moscow. How about Ayatollah Khamenei? How did it work out for him with the direct attacks against Israel in April and October of 2024, when our counsel was, hey, take the win, don't worry about that, Israel, thankfully, I think from our perspective, did everything we told them not to do. And as a result, they exposed the profound weakness in the axis of aggressors and in the Iranian threat network across the region, terrorist network across the region, and in Iran itself. So they all overextended based on overconfidence. So what are the ways that we can work together to restore peace, prevent these crises from cascading further, and build a more secure and prosperous future? I think the first thing we have to recognize is the connections. The connections between this axis of aggressors and how they are operating together, and to see them together as a whole. This would help us, I think, achieve a much higher degree of unity of effort against each of the individuals in this axis of aggressors, individual states, but against them overall. Every time we pretend that they're separate from one another, and we ask, Xi Jinping to do us a solid, to help us out on Iran, it gives them room to operate together. I think we should glue them together and hang their mutual problems around their necks like lodestones. So what are the specific ways we can do this? First of all, I think we can work on ourselves. I think we can restore trust in the transatlantic relationship, and we have to do that through empathy. We have to try to understand better what is driving and constraining the behavior of our friends from a political perspective, from a social perspective. I know there's a tendency in Europe at times to view the U.S. as barbarians, and maybe you're right. I mean, I kind of take that as a compliment, but as a society that manifests, the many evils of modernity and so forth. We see, some Americans see Europeans as freeloaders, on American security and largesse. A lot of President Trump's, most ardent supporters, look at Europe and say, hey, 18% of the world's economy, 50% of the world's social spending, they weren't investing in defense. So American taxpayers are underwriting their social spending by covering their defense bills. How does that make sense? So you have to think about like where does this, where's this tension coming from? Because I think this tension is being addressed, right? With now Germany in particular, in a very aggressive path by 2029 to meet 3.5% of GDP and hard defense spending and additional money for infrastructure. But I think it begins with empathy, and it begins with a positive agenda. I mean, I just want to say, okay, enough of the negativity, please. If you think about what we need to do, what is on a positive agenda for us, I think we can buy into it together. And if you think about it, for example, Trump's agenda equals the Draghi report in a lot of ways, in terms of deregulation, invigorating the industrial base, making supply chains more resilient, energy security, and so forth. And so let's try to replace some of the insults back and forth with a positive agenda. And one that's based on empathy. The second would be to pursue really no kidding peace through strength, and to recognize that there are no nifty ways. I mean, next time there's a European Union communique that says, "Oh, we really need to get to enduring peace through diplomacy alone." I mean, I would say, are you kidding me? I mean, it makes me think of look at the people we're dealing with, right? Have a little empathy by viewing, kind of the world from the perspective of the axis of aggressors and what they really want to achieve. And then I think come to the realization that, hey, hard power kind of really matters. And George Shultz, I was so honored to be a colleague of his for the last years of his life. He worked until the age of 100. He has this great saying. He said, negotiation is a euphemism for capitulation unless the shadow of power is cast across the bargaining table. And so recognize how we have to integrate elements of national power, and that we have to have strength in a number of new domains now. There are tremendous emerging threats. This is part of this positive agenda. We are all living like we're London under the V1 and V2 threat now, in terms of the missile and drone threat that we've seen Iran really perfect, this missile drone strike complex. And if you think about what the Ukrainians did with Operation Spiderweb, we have to be very concerned, right, about defending ourselves against these emerging threats on Earth, right, that come from autonomy and AI-related technologies, computing power at the edge. But the next war is going to go into space from the very beginning. And I think what we can learn from the war that's ongoing against Iran and in Ukraine is the increased transparency of the battlefield, and how that transparency combined with compute power and big data analytics associated with AI, combined with precision munitions, has really forced us to operate almost as if we're in visual range of the enemy, or will force us in a future war. This is compounded by attacks on our homeland in cyberspace, and there will be efforts to cripple us at the outset of a fight, which is why the next fight is going undersea, as we've seen with the cables that Russia and China are already cutting in the Baltic and region, in the shadow war against Europe. But the next war is going to go into space, and we have to be prepared for that as well. And then the first campaign of the next war will be a campaign designed to blind and deceive the enemy. And so we have to work on that together within the construct of NATO and with other partners around the world. The third thing that we can do in terms of taking advantage of opportunities and to work together on a positive agenda is to counter Chinese Communist Party economic aggression. And that involves first step of reducing the coercive power that China has over our economies. There are various ways to do that. Maybe we could talk more about that if you'd like, with working together on outbound and inbound investment screening, to work together on export controls in critical areas, but really to invest in our own competitive advantages, which is the next area that we have to really deepen our relationship in, to work together to win in critical technology competitions that are essential to the vibrancy of our economies and to our collective defense as well. And then finally, I think we've all learned that energy security is important, right? I mean, the leap here in Germany away from nuclear was, and the desire to go to exclusively renewables was a leap off a cliff and into Vladimir Putin's arms. I mean, I mean, President Trump. I mean, I know a lot of people don't like him here. It's I imagine, but he's not always wrong, And one of these meetings with Chancellor Merkel, he's like, Angela. Well, first thing he said is, if you love NATO so much, why don't you pay your dues? That's how he thinks about NATO, paying your dues. But the second thing he said is, why are we defending you? His words, and you're buying all this gas from Russia and feeding Putin's ATM, with Nord Stream 2. So I think we recognize now we have to all work together on energy security, and stop doing things that are just counterproductive. I mean, fossil fuels are definitely going to be here. Let's work together on SMRs, small meter reactors, or EM squared reactors, and so forth. And so let's replace that recognizing the opportunities we have, recognizing the weakness of the axis of aggressors, come up with a positive agenda that can allow us to build a more prosperous and peaceful future. Again, the main obstacles are our own divisions. We've seen kind of the rise of a far left that I think adheres to a philosophy of self-loathing associated with postmodernist, new left interpretations of history, where all the ills of the world, were caused by either colonialism in the colonial period or capitalist imperialism in the post-World War II period, or on the far right, which is embracing old forms of bigotry, racism, nativism, and these are interacting with one another, and they're creating centripetal forces that are pulling our societies apart. But I would say, hey, let's be optimistic, because despite these divisions, beside these problems, our democracies look really ugly and weak from the outside, but they're actually quite strong and resilient. Authoritarian regimes, they look really good on parade, don't they? I mean, they look really great from the outside. I mean, that military ballet in Tiananmen Square, man, it's impressive. The May Day parade, a little bit disappointing this year, in Moscow. But hey, but still, they're looking good. I mean, they can goose step, man. I mean, they look great, but they're actually brittle, And so it reminds me of what we can do is in our own power. It reminds me of course, a Clinton quotation, and of course the Clinton I'm referring to is George Clinton of Parliament Funkadelic, who in 1972 released the album America Eats Its Young. Think about the 70s, right? Wasn't pretty. Stagflation. About to lose a war in Vietnam. The first U.S. president in history resigns. Right. Multiple energy crises. Punctuate at the end of that decade, a hostage crisis in Iran, a real crisis of confidence. But in this, there's a track on that album, and it's entitled "If You Don't Like, if you don't like the effect, don't produce the cause." And so the Stoic philosopher George Clinton goes on to say, "Situation is just that; it has no power over you." Right, and so I think we could learn a lot from Stoic philosophy, and stop kind of the self-flagellation we've been engaged in, and bolster our confidence, and recognize we do have authorship over our own future, and we do have authorship because we are the beneficiaries of living in democratic societies where our votes count, and our governments have to reflect, our desires and our preferences. And then if I haven't made you, confident, I think we should all then listen to the great Otto von Bismarck, or at least a quotation attributed to him. And in terms of the relationship with the United States, have faith in what he said about the United States, where he said, "God has special providence for fools, drunkards, and the United States of America." So I guess if there's a main theme here on how to stop these crises from cascading further, restoring peace and building prosperity, it's a theme that I was talking to Amy before this, of our, I think our greatest founder, because he's a fellow Philadelphian of mine, Benjamin Franklin, as he said, as we're about to sign the Declaration of Independence, he said, "We all must hang together, or most assuredly, we will all hang separately." So thank you. I really look forward to the conversation. Thanks.
General McMaster, thank you for a rousing speech. and for expressing optimism, which I think is a truly great thing. And I'm going to want to probe that a bit more. And believe me, I think there are lots of good reasons for optimism. But I want to start off with a pointed question, if I may. Showing weakness. That thing in the Gulf, is that showing strength?
Yeah, I think it is, because I think that this war is really poorly reported on in the West. I mean, especially one aspect of it. Now, hey, believe me. Let me just back up here before I freak everybody out. I mean, I think that from a diplomatic perspective, a public diplomacy, communications perspective, it has been handled very poorly by the administration. Right, this inconsistent, unserious, bombastic, kind of language and so forth is self-defeating, and inconsistent with with the objectives of the war from a utilitarian perspective, and often inconsistent with our principles, like going back to St. Thomas Aquinas, and we're not going to destroy civilizations and so forth. So I've been critical about this, and in a way that I hope that some people come to their senses on the communication effort and the diplomatic effort. But the way I see this war in context is that this has been a 47-year-long war waged on the United States, Israel, Iran's Arab neighbors, and Europe. I mean, scores of assassinations in Europe by the Iranians over the years, and so I think what we did over multiple administrations was try to conciliate the Iranian regime, right, with this belief that if we welcome them back in to the international order, international economic order in particular, that that there will be this competition internal to the regime between the Republicans and the revolutionaries, and then the Republicans will be bolstered. But hey, the problem with that is the revolutionaries won the Civil War, in 1979, and they are firmly in charge. There were periods when Khatami came in the late 90s, maybe Rouhani, but these people are shop windows for the theocratic dictatorship of that regime that has as a permanent feature of its ideology hostility to the great Satan, the United States, the cancerous boil, Israel, that's sometimes called the little Satan, but that was preserved for Great Britain initially, or UK, and it's our neighbors, and they've caused more death and destruction than you can even imagine, right? I mean, look at the Syrian civil war alone, and what it did to the Syrian people, what it did to the neighboring countries, what it did to Europe. I mean, it's a big cause. The migration crisis associated with it is a big cause of some of the political polarization here. So Putin got a lot of what he wanted there, right? And Iran did as well. So I see this as a continuation and a new phase of that 47-year-long war, and the cost, I believe, of inaction. What is it? 60 days ago now, would have far surpassed the cost of action, because what the Iranian regime was doing is deepening its arsenal and building a much larger, order of magnitude larger capacity for missiles and drones, so they could build kind of a conventional shield behind which they could develop their the most destructive weapons on Earth. And they were actively doing that. So again, no war is without cost. I think this could have been managed much better, but I think it was an essential campaign at that moment. And we'll never know, because we can't prove a negative. But I think when we look back on this time, we'll say, hey, it was important to do, and it's good that we acted directly against the regime.
So let's agree to disagree.
Make your argument. I mean,
okay. So, every good Bismarck quote deserves another. The Balkans weren't worth the bones of a single Pomeranian sapper, and I think that every president who looked at this before Donald Trump said, this is a regime that is deeply rooted. Those governments, if I may really be cheeky, said, and there's the Strait of Hormuz, and they can take the global economy down. And there is no way that we are going to bring about honest to goodness change in that regime, except through the long and steady application of pressure. I mean, I don't know. I have to say, Hamas acted on its own. There's been no indication that Hamas has pulled the trigger because of Tehran. I mean, we both know the intelligence. The intelligence is really rich on this. Hamas is an independent organization.
Well, maybe you're getting briefed and I'm not, man, but I'm telling you, okay, who equipped them? Who trained them? Who gave them the communications devices? Who gave them the weapons, right? I mean, Iran.
Yeah,
who cultivated that relationship for decades?
I'm not saying that they didn't have an alliance, but I'm saying that they made their own decisions. And we know that they were surprised.
Why did Hezbollah come in the next day?
We know that Tehran was surprised. And, we had this great thing in the Cold War going called containment. Okay, why was it not going to work in Iran?
Okay, I'll tell you why it's not going to work in Iran. And it's because of the ideology that drives and constrains that regime. And it's because of really the unspeakable level of brutality they're willing to go to advance their objectives, which are really to establish hegemonic influence in the Middle East by keeping the Arab world perpetually enmeshed in conflict, to create these fitnas or sectarian civil wars, build a land bridge to the Mediterranean, which they did. Remember, they equipped Hezbollah with 150,000 rockets pointed at Israel. That was their big deterrent until Israel did, what everybody told them not to do, and they had Operation, Grim Beeper, and decapitated the leadership, and then that had cascading effects, which we're still seeing today, with maybe the possibility finally, at some stage in the future, of Hezbollah being disarmed to the degree that it can help pull Lebanon out of the free fall it's been in because of that terrorist organization having so much influence in that country for so long. So I think that over multiple administrations, you're saying pressure. Pressure was not kept on the regime, first of all. If you look at multiple administrations from Clinton to Reagan, I can go through the specifics, but especially the Obama years. The Obama years pulled Ayatollah Khamenei up off the mat in 2015 with sanctions relief, releasing seized assets, and that inflow of cash. Where did that go? It went to supporting the proxies in the region. The Biden administration came in, stopped enforcing the Trump sanctions on Iran, supplicated to the Iranians, in my view. What did the humiliation of staying in these hotels where they weren't even allowed to talk to them, and we were using the Russians as interlocutors. Remember on October 8th of 2023, we were about to transfer, the Biden administration was about to transfer $16 billion to the Iranians that day, the day after October 7th. And they were still going to do it until there was a congressional outcry. So I think that this is what got them up off the mat again, alleviated the pressure, gave them the resources that they needed to ultimately enmesh the whole region in the war that it's in now.
Well, I think we're going to have to go over the record pretty carefully. The U.S. intelligence community was quite clear that the Iranians were not trying to fabricate a nuclear weapon at the time of any of these conflicts, that in fact the one break on that was Ayatollah Khamenei. And it seems to me that we have ensured that we are going to get the Iran of our worst dreams now, because we have shown them that we're determined to cause regime change. We are not prepared to go into Iran and take care of that. And as a result, they have every incentive on earth to make a race for the bomb, to make a race for a dirty bomb using the enriched uranium they have, and they're going to be far more dangerous. And I don't know if Steve Erlanger is still here, but the New York Times is reporting 70% of their launchers are still intact. We have gotten ourselves into a big mess.
I think that's a nonsensical number, by the way, but it's a nonsensical number. Not that it's your fault, but here's.
I hope you're reassured, Steve.
If you're developing a peaceful nuclear program, why are you burying it deeply in secret sites? If you agree to a nuclear deal,
of course there was.
Why is it day after?
There was surveillance until Trump pulled out.
Inadequate. It was an inadequate inspection and a verification regime. Before the ink was dry on the JCPOA, do you remember the Iranians put out a list of all the sites that you couldn't look at, including every military site? Come on, Dan. The day after Trump pulled out of the JCPOA, and I advised him to stay in and make it so painful on Iran, despite still being in, that they got out themselves. I thought that would be an appropriate way to do it, but one of the many other Trump national security advisors who came in after me, wasn't going to do that. So didn't advise him to do that. But remember the day after we pulled out, they said, okay, we're then going to restart the nuclear weapons program that we said never existed. You can't, and then they enriched to 60% uranium. What do you need 60% uranium for? Nothing. No, except the bomb.
So there's,
right?
no question they wanted a threshold. They wanted to break out capacity. I don't disagree with that. I just think that we gave them every incentive to pursue that program. And once we reviewed the verification measures, they're off to the races. I just have never understood it. I will tell you, I interviewed in my last job a guy who was responsible for creating the Israeli Cyber Authority and their space program. He was a protege of Ariel Sharon, and he said to me, and he was a hawk, and he said to me, there's not a single person in the Israeli national security establishment who doesn't think the JCPOA is a really great deal. And I said, there's one, and he said, he's not in the establishment.
Well, we could tell anecdotes all day, Dan, but I think that's nonsense too. Okay.
All right. So the axis of aggressors, why are we lifting sanctions on Russia?
I don't think we should be lifting sanctions on Russia. It was temporary to loosen constraints on global oil flow associated with the shutoff of the Strait of Hormuz. I don't think it's doing anything to ameliorate the economic crisis that Putin's in. I think he's in a real difficult spot. But I would not be in favor of alleviating any sanctions on him. In fact, I would be in favor of additional EU-U.S. sanctions on Putin.
So let's go to common ground. Optimism. I thought it was great to hear what you say about U.S. and Europe, and I couldn't agree more. We began this semester with Steve Biegun. You overlap? Did you not?
No, I recruited him to be my deputy national security advisor, but he was in a private sector job he couldn't get out of. I actually even sent his wife flowers. Didn't work. It didn't work. But he after he finished that job, which he felt he owed that company to do, then he came in into the State Department. State Department, yeah. And he had the North Korea portfolio, State Department. And then was deputy Secretary of State. After a great guy as well, John Sullivan. Those guys were two gems of public servants right there.
Couldn't agree more. So he was here, and he gave a truly rousing speech. Not quite as rousing as yours, but very rousing.
Glad to hear that.
Very arousing.
Because Steve is very calm guy. You know?
Yeah. No, it was more of a State Department. It was more of a State Department speech in which he argued two things: one, Ukraine must win, and two, NATO is not endangered. And it was great to hear. I can't say. I'm more optimistic about Ukraine even than I was when he was here, because they seem to have taken the cauldron of conflict and really turned it to their advantage. It would be nice if they were getting real weapons from the U.S., but thankfully Germany is standing up. But the second part
they're getting weapons that are manufactured in the U.S. through the Europeans purchasing them, and that program is still going. Although there's been, of course, diminished supplies that people are concerned about these days.
Yeah, because of all those weapons we used.
But the financial relief from the EU after the Hungary election also was a big deal.
Big deal.
Yeah.
So I guess the question is, again, I'm going to refer to the great gray lady, the New York Times, which has written a number of articles saying, well, what's left of Article 5 if there's already lots of questions being cast upon it? And you mentioned Greenland yourself. Living in Berlin in the era of Davos at the time of Greenland and all that, people were in shock. And you have to say, is America going to come to our rescue if, God forbid, something happens?
Yeah. So, unfortunately, this is what President Trump misses is oftentimes is how what he says will be perceived abroad, right? He is a master communicator to his political base, his most loyal political base. And almost everything that he says that shocks us, we're like, oh, really? It's sort of aimed at that base, and so when I was in the job, I'm not on social media. I probably never will. My daughter does my stuff for me. They send stuff out, but But Katie would have to like tell me in the morning, hey, this is what you just tweeted last night. But it wasn't anything as damaging as some of the things we've seen recently, especially with the way what he says about Greenland, which he thinks, oh, I'm riffing in my New York real estate guy way, and it has a profound impact. And actually, it's completely counterproductive to his agenda. So this is a good example. If you care about Arctic security and missile security, which he does, then how do you do that without Canada and without Greenland and then by connection Denmark? And the argument to make about that, the argument to make about the Panama Canal is that, hey, the United States is on the side of sovereignty. And when I had a hand in drafting parts of his speeches in 2017 to 2018, if you go back to those speeches, look at the speech he gave to the UN General Assembly 2017. Look at the Warsaw speech he gave in 2017. Look at the APEC speech that he gave in 2017. All of those emphasize strong sovereign nations, the importance of strong sovereign nations who respect the sovereignty of their neighbors and the sovereignty of their people. And that's what he liked that language, because he is part of a movement that you also see in Europe of voters who think that we have given up too much of our sovereignty to international organizations, faceless bureaucrats in Brussels for this crowd, and so you have to take your sovereignty back, damn it, and so. But and the U.S. wins when we're on the side of sovereignty. But if you say to Panama, "Hey, we'll just take the canal," you lose the argument. If you say we're going to, so the winning argument is in favor of sovereignty. If I can get him like one message, that would be it. Is to go back to that message. So he was not serious, in my view, about like invading Greenland, but he didn't realize that him saying that would be taken so damn seriously. And what was even worse than that, in my view, was the offhanded comments like, "Oh, NATO hasn't done anything for us. They're kind of behind, us, and they fight, but not that much." Well, he had just insulted Denmark, who took more casualties per capita than any other NATO nation, who fought very hard in Helmand Province in Afghanistan with a very capable combined arms battle group. So I don't think there's been a breakdown, I think, in some of the advice he's getting, and not to make apologies for him. I mean, he's responsible for his words, everything else, but he doesn't think through the second and third order effect. He doesn't think. Empathy is not his strong suit. I don't know if anybody noticed that. You notice that?
I hardly know how to come back from that. Steve Began's line was NATO is something that Americans in their bones are committed to. And I would append to that on the basis of my years of interaction with the U.S. military, which is that our officers truly believe that allies are a force multiplier. And so I remain optimistic, but I'm quite worried about regaining the trust. And I'm curious how you see this problem.
Yeah, well, of course, trust operates at all different levels, right? And, this is the 250th anniversary of our revolution based on that radical idea that sovereignty lies with the people, not with the king, not with parliament, right? But with the people. And, anybody who really knows America knows that power, despite, how the president is front and center every moment, it seems, power is quite diffuse in the United States. And our founders had this brilliant vision of dividing power and then dividing it more, and then dividing it more. Obviously, with the separation of powers in Article 1, 2, and 3 of the Constitution, the legislature being Article 1, I think they've been a little bit asleep on the job for a while, but anyway, they need a little bit of help, work, encouragement, gosh. But checks on presidential power are in place. I mean, if you look at the Supreme Court decisions, on tariffs, for example, on presidential tariff authority, and the authorities that Congress has given up to the executive, they gave up. They can take back. So division of power still works. I think the catastrophism on the far left, in the way, especially here, you'll be sensitive to this. People, use the word fascism, dictator. I mean, I think it's not helpful. I mean, the catastrophism actually feeds, kind of the elements of the far right who then say, they're trying to censor, label. just stop the catastrophism. And then also, we're a federal system. I mean, so much of power in the United States is at the state and local level, and so much of the power of the United States is commercial. It's cultural. It's like, so anyway, and hey, and also the American people elected Donald Trump, and so, he's not, again, the determinant of all these relationships himself. He has a big influence on it. And the American people will have opportunities to elect the next person too. Now, I hope what we're able to do in both political parties is to begin to nominate people for general elections who have broader appeal with independents and even members of other parties. What's happened in the United States, and I think this is fair to say is happening in Europe as well, is that the fringes kind of bring out a base of people to vote. And in our primary system, in the two-party system, what that does is it elects people in the primaries that do not have broad appeal in the general election. So it leaves a lot of people dissatisfied. But because we are a democracy, because we have a say in how we're governed, I think the parties in self-interest are going to have to realize, hey, well, if I nominate a nutty person, one side or the other, if somebody thinks, I mean, some of the kind of radical social agenda on the far left, it was crazy to me, man. I mean, it was like, are you kidding me? I mean, and what some of the things that they were pushing in the military were crazy. But what that does is it creates an unequal and opposite reaction on the far right too, So the vast majority of Americans want none of either of that. And so I just think we have to figure out, how the parties can reform, and then maybe, does open primaries solve it? Maybe not. Maybe it does. I don't know. Mo Fiorina is one of my colleagues at Stanford who does great work on this. I'm just a washed up general. I shouldn't talk about domestic politics.
All right, I got a million more questions, and I'm going to exercise just a little restraint for a change. And it's time to go to the audience, though I reserve the right to ask again. Oh, no, it's the New York Times. Nobody expects the New York Times.
When you least expect it,
That's
here
right.
comes the Spanish Inquisition.
I love the Monty Python analogy. I mean,
General, I'm going to ask a question.
Come back and I will taunt you another time.
No, that's okay. Exactly. Exactly. I'm going to ask you a bit of a hypothetical question, but I mean, given what you've said about Putin and about Ukraine, do you think there was any serious thought, since we knew from our intelligence that Putin was actually preparing to invade Ukraine in 2022? We couldn't convince the Germans, we couldn't convince the French, we couldn't convince Zelensky, but we knew. Why didn't we put in a lot of American troops into Ukraine before the war? We had troops in Ukraine who were training Ukrainians. I mean, you were in favor of the javelins, for which the Ukrainians should build you a statue. But if it's about deterrence, what prevented us from trying to stop the war from happening in a real way?
Well, I think it's people who just don't understand war, and who think that an actor like Putin can be dissuaded by kind of nifty mechanisms, and in the Obama presidency, actually, their national defense strategy came up with this phrase "integrated deterrence," which I think should have substituted pixie dust for that. It was that we're just going to be extra nifty in the way that we do diplomacy, in the way we do intelligence, that we won't need that much hard power, and hard power really does matter. And I think that if you can imagine, if we had provided just a fraction of the capabilities that we later provided to the Ukrainians, and this is a criticism across multiple administrations, would Putin have invaded? I think hell no. He invaded because he thought it was going to be a walk in the park, really, and that was a failure of the GRU and the SVR. But it also was, we could have done a lot more to bolster them. And I think the only thing we really would have needed was, to provide them with more capable indirect fire systems, longer range precision fire systems, maybe some mobile protected firepower in the form of, Bradley fighting vehicles or Leopards and so forth. And I don't think he would have done it. I really don't think he would have done it.
Since you brought up the national security strategy, How do you feel about civilizational erasure as being a central issue in the current one? And I'm sorry.
Are you talking about like from migration, or what are you talking about?
It's in the current national security strategy
Yeah.
that Europe is endangered by civilizational erasure. The implication being that too many people of the wrong color have been moving into Europe and have erased its or endangered its fundamental character. It's a very strange thing to show up in a national security strategy.
Yeah, it's also a really strange thing, I would say, to not secure your border. That's really strange in my view. And this is what happened during the Biden administration. The border was unsecured. Millions of people came into the country uncontrolled. And you know what that created? A huge backlash from the American electorate, who elected people who were going to write stuff like that in a national security strategy. So again, I think what you have here is kind of an unequal and opposite reaction. You have, this is, and you're living this in Europe as well, right? I mean, with the Schengen zone and the lack of border security, I believe Vladimir Putin deliberately weaponized migration, centered on the Syrian civil war, to cause a migration crisis that would destabilize European politics. So, I mean, I think that's why it's in there, is because it's a reaction.
So wait a second. I can't let you off the hook here. The president every day of the week.
I didn't write it, Dan. I didn't write it.
I know that.
Okay.
I know that. But every day of the week, the president blames Sleepy Joe Biden for all the things that are wrong in the country. You can't blame Biden for the national security strategy written by the Trump administration.
No, I'm explaining it though. I'm explaining that this is a reaction, right? I mean, when the Biden administration pushed on the Department of Defense, I think an ideology that is destructive to military effectiveness. And what I'm talking about here is equality of outcome instead of equality of opportunity. I'm talking about the valorization of victimhood. I'm talking about the idea that you should judge the soldier next to you based on their identity category rather than their sense of honor, their courage, their willingness to sacrifice for the mission and for each other. All of those ideas of these postmodernist, nonsensical ideas were being pushed on the military by, political appointees, right, in the Biden administration, because I don't think the president was aware of half of what was going on, and so that's happening, and then the Trump administration comes in, and the current Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, I think fundamentally misunderstands the chain of command. That the civilians are in charge. He's in charge. He won the election. And so what he's doing, though, in reaction to the administration that's no longer there, is he's fighting a rear guard against phantoms. Saying that like generals and admirals are woke. Okay, I mean, Stephen and I might know a couple of woke professors, at Stanford. I mean, maybe, I don't know. I wouldn't even label them as such. I think it's not a useful term. But hey, I don't think there are any woke generals and admirals. I've never met one, and so you have this kind of narrative that feeds off each other, right? So under the Biden years, it was how the military is extremist, based on a misrepresentation of the January 6th attacks on the Capitol. That veterans were overrepresented, which they weren't, but they did an extremist stand down day, and so I wonder why military recruiting fell off. The entire gap in military recruiting in the Biden years were white males who probably didn't want to be labeled as extremists. And so what that generated on the other end is this kind of, remember the general officer conclave that was held, or, convocation, I guess I should say, and accusations. Well, if you're loyal to the Department of Woke, no, you know what those officers are loyal to? The Constitution of the United States, and then you have now, and even then a reaction to that overreaction, where you have 6 senators and congressmen do this film. I don't know if this was covered much in Germany, but, telling soldiers, listen, whatever you do, don't follow illegal orders. But the wink behind that was, from Trump, orders from Trump, And so now here you have those who represent Article 1 of the Constitution, a real legitimate check on executive power, suggesting what our founders feared more than anything else 250 years ago was that the military would consider itself as a check on executive power. That's crazy. So what's happening is this hyperpolarization and is feeding off of one another is creating aberrant and destructive behavior, that I think is a threat, to our, especially to our confidence in our democratic institutions, principles, and processes. Too many politicians are too eager to compromise really confidence in our institutions, confidence in our democracy broadly, to score partisan political points. And I think until the electorate says, hey, stop doing that, or I'll vote you out, we're going to see a continuation of this behavior.
Ambassador Gutman.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for just an amazing presentation. Whether you agree or disagree, it is an amazing presentation. And I've never met a woke general either. You've met many more, but speaking from somebody who has met many woke people, falsely. But here's my question. You emphasize how important national sovereignty is and respect for it, how important trust among our allies is. So now that you've given us the historical overview, in this group, what would your advice be to the President of the United States now that Germany and our NATO allies have really stepped up on military? What can the US do at the presidential level to make it possible to hang together so we don't hang separately? Yeah. To make that trust and respect for national sovereignty, which, if NATO means anything, it's based on trust among allies and respect for national sovereignty.
Okay, well, thanks. I think there's a lot that the president could do to just kind of get over this. The first would be, hey, take credit for what's already happening if you want. I mean, it really, it's been, everybody knows it's been multiple American administrations who have been given this lecture. Wolfgang knows it. This was Secretary Gates at Munich, was adamant about, hey, European countries are not investing enough in defense. And so it didn't happen until recently. So, hey, take credit for that. But then I think what we're going to have to do is see tangible acts that demonstrate the mutual benefit of the alliance. I think we have to get over, this kerfuffle we're in, about the Iran war, the reaction to it, maybe the chancellor's recent comments, because it is in all of our interests to have freedom of navigation in the Straits of Hormuz. It's in all of our interests to be against, I believe, a regime that murdered 40,000 of its own people in a 48-hour period in January, right? That's something we should probably be able to all get behind. And so I think putting together the multinational task force for freedom of navigation in the Persian Gulf, which we've all rehearsed for every year for 30 years, how long it's been, to do something like that. On the U.S. side, it would be to provide what are now kind of the suspended sale of the long-range precision strike capabilities to Germany, for example. That's a tangible thing. I would like to see the reversal of the decision to withdraw my old regiment, the 2nd Cavalry Regiment, from Europe, if not Germany, and recognition of the importance to collective security of forward position capable U.S. joint forces, because U.S. joint forces are kind of the hub that brings in so much, everything from strategic lift to communications to access to certain intelligence and space-based capabilities. The theater of defense that you saw put into place, in the Middle East, when Israel was attacked directly, or in this onslaught, 2,800 projectiles fired at the UAE, for example, that's a U.S. backbone that provides that. Of course, the nuclear umbrella. But there are huge benefits to the U.S. When President Trump he's always been skeptical, about the forward position troops abroad. I showed him a couple things. One thing that I showed him was a response to the 9/11 mass murder attacks, and how quickly we were able to, within a month, to get into Afghanistan with forces operating at scale against the Taliban government, right? And then I showed him what it would look like if we didn't have forward positioned forces and the overflight rights and so forth. I think it was a big mistake by the German leadership to suspend overflight rights, for example. I don't know if we'll ever get over it with Spain until the current leader's gone and that far left party is gone in Spain. But I think that showing that benefit it was important, and just heck the for it actually costs a lot less for for U.S. forces to be stationed abroad because some of the cost sharing arrangements, and you've got the great training centers in Vilsec and so forth, for the second Cav regiment. So anyway, I think showing those benefits will be helpful, and reversing some of these decisions, building the trust up with actions, I think. Thanks, Ambassador.
How about right here?
Thank you so much for the rousing presentation. And my wife had to leave, but I want to put this to you and ask first a question, and then I still make one little comment. The question would be, at the very beginning, you said that Europe is experiencing populism and polarization, and that is a threat to Europe. So my question to you is then, if this axis of antagonists, or axis, did you call it, axis of aggressors, thank you, would, from a European perspective, rightfully include some US oligarchs who are, and the vice president, by the way, who are actively supporting right-wing populist parties across Europe, right? So would you include them? And should Europeans be very concerned about these? And then the second comment, if I may, is just your excusing Trump for not quite knowing and not being briefed. For me as a German, both my grandparents were Nazis. That rings back to history, where wenn das der Führer wüsste, if Hitler would know this, it wouldn't happen. So I just put this to you. That's
the analogy I think we should avoid, brother. I mean, that's part of the problem.
You're speaking in Germany.
Yeah,
you're speaking in Germany, and you're defending the actions of an authoritarian kleptocrat.
Okay. First of all, I'm not. What I'm saying is that I'm placing the responsibility on Trump that he does not consider the second and third order effects. He does not consider how what he says, how what he puts out on Truth Social will be regarded by others. That's his deficiency, right? So, I mean, I do think that because I was in that position to do it, I oftentimes told him, hey, this sentence in the speech, these two sentences in the speech, it will play well with your base. But here's the effect that it's going to have on an international audience who will read and parse every single word. And he took it out, except for one time. So I'm not excusing him for anything. The second thing is, hey, you should probably hope that more U.S. politicians and oligarchs campaign for far-right parties, because it didn't work out very well for Orban. And so I think you should advocate for more of it. But from an empathetic perspective, and we know, like AFD, right? AFD has a very strong streak of anti-Americanism in it, because much of it is grounded in the old GDR and the ideology of the far left. So, but hey, I would say that they see it, look at it from their perspective, as censorship and impingement on free speech. Look at what's happened in the UK, for example. That's how they see it, because they also see in the US a reaction that occurred after Trump won. Certain people were debanked and so forth. This is like an emotional issue for them. So, I would say try to view it from their perspective. I don't think interference in anybody's election is a good idea by anybody, any foreign party at all. I think that American diplomats, American business leaders should stay mute about that subject. In the interest of sovereignty and not infringing on sovereignty. That the Russians are going to be all over you during this election, as they will be in France, as they will be in the UK. And so that. Yeah, but hey, I would advise against it. But they see the kind of stifling of some of these movements as excessive. I mean, look at what they said about Giorgia Meloni, right, in Italy. They see it through that lens. Okay, Giorgia Meloni, in my view, has done a pretty fantastic job in Italy. And so, I just think that we have to be careful about labeling people, and we have to be careful as well about certainly, as you're mentioning, interfering in or trying to influence the outcome of elections of other sovereign countries. I think we should just stay out of it.
All right, I have to call on my brother because he's visiting.
Without taking sides in the slugfest over going into Iran,
can you
with the
not
Straits,
take sides? I'm your
with what
brother.
happened with the Straits of Hormuz, though, I had a strong sense of deja vu. Dan and I remember well sitting in the back of our mother's station wagon in 1973 for an hour to get a quarter of a tank of gasoline. And our legendary grandmother would chastise us if we left electricity on because of the cost. I'm not asking you to embrace climate science. I think that's going to be a tough sell. But what about
Why do you think that?
what about renewables?
No, why'd you just take that jab?
No,
No, explain it.
Well,
Explain why I would not
well,
accept
you
climate
said
science.
fossils are here forever. You said it.
You don't believe that.
They're here, but why
They were
don't
still
we think
burning wood,
about
man. We're still burning
renewable
wood,
energy
you know.
as national security? Renewable energy as national security. Don't worry about the science because they've got us. Okay, and West Texas Intermediate trades the same as Brent, and the U.S. consumer is paying a lot in the pump and his mortgage is going up. I'm not asking you to embrace climate science. You may not. But nobody thinks about renewables as national security. And the most unstable region in the world has a huge factor of production. And it's been 50 years and we haven't learned anything.
Okay, thank you. There's no question.
No, do you believe renewables should be considered as part of national security?
Yeah, I mean, all energy sources, all of the above. We need all of the above solutions. You know, this idea that that you can leap away from fossil fuels is just not borne out by the facts. And you know, the largest reduction in man-made carbon emissions in history was associated with the availability of cheap natural gas in the United States because of fracking technology. That's what did it. The free market did it. So all of these interventions that are designed for developed economies to subsidize transitions away from carbon sources of energy they're a fraud. They haven't worked. They don't work. So even if you believe the climate science, even if you're an advocate for renewables, you have to at least acknowledge it's not working. So let's do something different. Let's prioritize getting off of coal. Let's prioritize nuclear fission technologies that are zero emission and recognize that you need sources of technology that are not wholly dependent on the wind blowing and the sun shining. Because how did that work out for Germany? Is that working out well for you? Is it working out well for the UK? Well, okay. Yeah, but okay. So you probably drove here in your Teslas and are forcing everybody else to use public transportation. Congratulations.
People here took the S-Bahn. Laura.
It took a bike.
BASF uses more energy than Switzerland, okay? And it's not going to all come from solar panels and wind turbines.
All right. I have a question regarding China policy, because you mentioned that the EU should really take more efforts to collaborate with the US on economic security, from export controls to investment and all of the above. And I thought it was very impressive how you described the axis of aggressors earlier on, overextending based on overconfidence and then failing. Would you say from a military perspective that China is also currently overconfident? And if it's not, is it, or even if it is it still the number one priority of US security policy? And if that too still is true, what does it say about Taiwan policy and the messaging there regarding Taiwanese independence and arms deliveries?
Okay, God, what a great and comprehensive question. You know, I do think that China's overextended. I think China overextended in its race to surpass the United States. I had a note on that, but I was running out of time, and I wanted Dan to harass me as soon as possible. So I do think they've overextended. A friend of mine, Matt Pottinger, who many of you may know, who's fantastic on China, and was, I think, the person most responsible for the big shift in foreign policy in the United States from cooperation and engagement to transparent competition. I don't know where it is now. It's, you know, who knows where it is after the last meeting. I think President Trump's going to back his way back into that approach that he had until he began to chase the phase 2 trade deal, and Trump won. This didn't happen. But in their race to surpass the U.S., Ponder talks about really that there being 4 main engines of the Chinese economy. I'm quoting him because, again, you don't want washed-up generals doing economic analysis. But, engine 1, real estate, right? And that's on fire, right? The real estate sector. The second is international investment. If anybody's investing in China, if any of your money's in China, I think you should get it the heck out immediately, because it's going to be stranded there. But that's dried up. The third is the consumer economy, trying to get that going. That's failing, as you know, and people don't have confidence because of the real estate crisis, a number of other factors. There's massive youth unemployment and underemployment in the country, which is affecting consumer demand. And the only engine that seems to be just humming along is industrial production and export. And that's happening at your expense, with the artificial low price associated with many of these goods. These are due to state subsidies. They're due to granting of land and so forth, but direct subsidies to companies. And then once they steal your IP to get access to the market, for example, this is the cycle that Volkswagen has gone through and others, and apply that technology into a subsidized Chinese company, they shut you down out of their market, and then dump those goods on the international market and to drive you out of business. And so that cycle has happened so many times, and more people are realizing this, and so I think that. What's going to happen, and this, I think, with the EU leadership that's in place now, they see this quite clearly, that the U.S. is going to realize, whether it's this administration or the next one, that we all have to continue to work together to counter these various forms of Chinese economic aggression, and we have to do so, with kind of the tools of economic statecraft applied in a way that recognizes that's the fundamental source of our problems, and to be more effective. You see this with a lot of the Trump administration, bilateral trade agreements that deal with transshipment, for example. Recognizes that China's a problem. I hope the USMCA, which is U.S., Mexico, Canada, agreement gets renegotiated successfully. That'll be a big part of that agreement. I think will be countering Chinese efforts to move into the hemisphere in ways that are unfair, using unfair trade practices. On Taiwan, I would say the most important thing to watch in the next month is whether or not President Trump approves the $14 billion additional weapon sales to Taiwan. That'll be the most important factor in sustaining Taiwan's ability to deter an attack, to convince Xi Jinping and the PLA leadership that they cannot take Taiwan by coercion or direct attack at an acceptable cost and risk. The flashpoint beyond that to watch, I think, is early 2028 with the Taiwanese election. And if it's a DPP election, then I think you're going to see ratcheting up dramatically of pressure on Taiwan, like a soft quarantine, a declaration of control over the airspace, for example. If it's a DPP victory, I think that a KMT victory, I'm sorry, they will try to go for annexation by invitation, continue to co-opt elites, continue to try to convince that leadership it has no option, no alternative, but to acquiesce and take kind of more of a Hong Kong approach to extinguishing human freedom in Taiwan.